From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network, and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. Laura Westley, a West Point graduate with a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry and a minor in nuclear engineering. Pretty impressive. She was deployed to Kuwait and then the Iraq War in 2003. She's now an author, playwright, performer, advocate for mental health and women's rights. Her book, New War Virgin, My Journey of Repression, Temptation, and Liberation, a memoir by Laura Westley. It's an amazing book on many levels, from a repressed, abusive childhood, getting through West Point, evangelical Christian woman off to war, sexual harassment, mental health issues, even contemplating suicide at one point, ultimately finding her path. Quite a story. We want to welcome Laura. Thanks for serving our country, Laura. How are you?
Thanks so much, Jim. It's an honor to be here. I really appreciate your wonderful words and feedback, and I'm doing really well. Thank you. How are you?
Let's start off with tell us why you wrote this book, and how you got through West Point, where we sort of start things off. You can mention your family, I guess, issues leading into West Point. I found it interesting that the same sort of oppression that you lived with growing up, you went right into it at West Point.
Exactly. In a lot of respects, West Point was just a continuation of that childhood, of that same dynamic. To answer the first question, why I wrote the book, I feel like I definitely have some unique life experiences that made for an interesting narrative. And I also feel like that what is present in literature and even in film is not necessarily indicative of a majority of the population of the military. And so I wanted to contribute a raw and authentic story that educates the general public in a way, in a human story and a war story that is different from what they are able to get by going to the bookstore. And I also wanted to write something to help prepare younger people who might be contemplating a career in the military, to teach them what they can expect, because I had no idea what would happen to me. And this is the kind of book that I wish someone put in my hands when I thought to myself, I want to go to West Point. I want to join the military. It ought
to be required reading, but I doubt West Point would put that in their orientation materials, but who knows? Now, there were only
Actually, I met with, I was just at West Point for my 15-year reunion.
Wow.
A week and a half ago. And I met with the head professor of the English department and asked him point blank, why is my book not required reading for the incoming freshman class? I was joking with him. He hadn't heard of my book yet, but now he has a copy of the book, and so who knows what might happen. And there are now copies in the West Point Cadet bookstore. So my hope is that the message really gets out there.
I think there were 12% women in your class. What's it like to get through there as a woman?
I think that it's more challenging getting through there as a woman than a man. I know that West Point has made a lot of great strides to improve gender integration, and I know that nowadays there's 20% women there. But I think that for my particular experience, it was more challenging because I never felt like I really belonged. And it's almost like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. I felt like in some respects, I wasn't masculine enough to be taken seriously to be capable of leading men into whether that would be a theoretical battle one day, which turned out to be reality, or any number of paths that might transpire in the military. And in the same breath, I wasn't considered feminine enough to be a real woman who would be considered worthy of being someone's partner, or be, to date or to get married to, or, whatever that might be. So it's like, I wasn't good enough in any respect. So that's what made it especially challenging.
And the funny thing is, you're too modest, but you were at the top, I think top 10% in the mixed metrics. There's physical, there's leadership, there's academic, and you were actually quite a leader in your class, right?
I was in the top 10% physically. I was in about the top third overall because that takes into account you have an academic, a military, and a physical score. So I definitely performed very well physically. I was always on the dean's list academically, except one semester where I had a really bad head injury. The military, you get a military grade, and it's based on like how tough your demeanor is in formation, and I did all right in that respect, but definitely stronger academically and physically. But then leadership roles that I did, I was the president of the Cadet Chapel Choir for 2 years. So that was, that's a big way that I contributed.
Very impressive. Okay, so you're this nice evangelical Christian girl who's going off to war in Iraq. Tell us what that was like. What's it like? What's it like? We have this sort of idealized vision of soldiers over there. Tell us the real world.
I think that there are three, when you're deployed in an environment and there's deprivation that occurs, you become really raw and almost like animalistic, I think. And I remember there being like three pervading thoughts, like, where am I going to go to the bathroom? When am I going to get to eat a nice big juicy steak? And when am I going to get to be intimate with another human being? So there are like all the feelings and urges that are natural to any human being. Not only do they exist on the battlefield, I believe that they become even more amplified on the battlefield because of fear and because of violence and sex being so intermingled. Like those emotions are really intermingled. So there's a lot of desire, there's a lot of fear, there's and just like with West Point, I feel like there's this idealized notion of what a West Point cadet looks and acts and behaves like. It's still a college. It's still, there are still college kids that are coming of age that are, figuring out their hormones and how to relate to each other. And that's, just like any kind of like adult dynamics that might take place in the workplace, like that's happening on the battlefield as well.
And you have some amazing components in here. I mean, the sleeping conditions, you might have a guy right in the next bunk to you, could be a married guy, and it just seems kind of amazing. Now, I guess the stats in the book, sexual harassment, 1 in 3 in the regular world. Is it worse in the military? What sexual harassment did you experience over there?
I experienced it in different realms. I feel like I experienced it in a very oppressive nature from my chain of command. I feel like my boss wanted to use his authority to kind of keep tabs on me. Like he wanted to know when we were deployed, how long are you going to be in the shower? I need you back here right away. He also asked to be my roommate. So it was harassing. Like he never came out and said, like, I want to do these things to you. But definitely using his authority over me to be really inappropriate about our sleeping conditions. And when I turned him down, I didn't want to be his roommate. He got very upset with me and started being really nasty to me to the extent where a senior officer had to tell him to back off. And eventually, we had to be separated from working together.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. So that was that in that respect. And then I feel like my brigade commander, his harassment was different. It was overarching for the entire unit. He wouldn't allow the women to change their clothes in private. He set conditions in our co-ed tent. He purposefully wanted us to sleep 3 inches away from each other and not hang up any ponchos or towels to cover ourselves. It's like he wanted to set conditions so the men could have a better chance of looking at us. He augmented General Order Number 1, which is this rule that doesn't allow alcohol consumption or sex during a military deployment, and he augmented that by banning masturbation. And so it's like he was adding to this very sexually charged environment. And then he asked really inappropriate things of our female battle captain, very, lewd sexual innuendos, and undermined her performance as a heroic battle captain. And then, so that it definitely happened from the chain of command, like where they were, taking their authority. But then it also happened on like a peer level where my battle buddy was very sexually aggressive and very forward and and bullying me into coming out of my shell and trying to get me to take my clothes off and do things with him. And I definitely caved in a lot of those instances because I had no idea what was coming my way. And in the same respect, this is someone who I knew would have my back. I knew he would take a bullet for me. I trusted him with my life. So it was this very confusing dynamic where I didn't immediately recognize and acknowledge the sexual harassment and the unwanted sexual contact that was taking place.
I'm Jim Campbell. We're talking with Laura Westley, a West Point grad who went to war. Business Talk with Jim Campbell can be heard on Business Talk Radio Network Sundays 10 to 11 a.m. Eastern, and again 10 to 11 p.m. Eastern. Go to biztalkradio.com. I'm Jim Campbell. We're talking with Laura Westley, a West Point grad who went to war, who went through a lot of life changes. On a personal basis, what's going on in your head right now? I mean, your father's basically laid down. You're evangelical Christian. You're to remain a virgin. You're now the war virgin. How are you processing this in your own mind?
I went through a lot of therapy. So I think that's really important. I think that anytime you have this profound experience of being at war, and not just being at war, but also going through a dramatic life change where you go from one extreme to the other, the pendulum definitely swung in the opposite direction after, after being a repressed, religious, innocent girl and losing my innocence and having been to war. I think it's really important to be reflective and process that and get help from a professional. So I've been through a lot of therapy. And I think the writing process in of itself has been very therapeutic. So I'm in a position now where I feel really strong in my convictions. I feel like I'm in a position where I can speak about this and I know what I believe. I'm confident in who I am, and I know to not take inappropriate, mistreatment from people. With that being said, I think I'm still vulnerable. I in addition to this book, I have a musical comedy show that I perform, and so I'm performing my story on a regular basis. I'm on tour right now, and sometimes I have very vivid dreams after a performance or after a rehearsal. I'm not like this. I'm still vulnerable. It's still possible to be impacted. And so I have to take very extensive measures of self-care to be in the position that I'm in and to be talking about this and to be talking about deeply personal things, like going to yoga and going to acupuncture and going to therapy. But in the same respect, I won't go back to my past. I'm definitely a new woman with really strong beliefs and convictions. And I am really compelled to use my story as an example so people can identify when they're being abused or oppressed or mistreated so they can take the steps that they need to liberate themselves.
And on a lighter note, I think it was pretty cool that you went skinny dipping in one of Saddam's palace pools.
Amen.
All right, let's get to the reforms that you're suggesting. You're calling for fundamental culture change in the Army. Let's talk about that and transition in that you actually contemplated suicide once you got back into civilian life.
Yeah, it was a while. I had been a civilian for a while, and I went through a really dark period of time after my father passed away. I was living in Boston, and I went through a divorce, and then my father passed away not too long after that, and I was working from home. It was a bitter cold winter, and I just felt like I wanted a life do-over. I was working on War Virgin, but I knew that I still had a long road ahead of me, that the book wasn't anywhere near to being completed, and that where I wanted to take the show, it just felt really daunting. And I think that, despite all the therapy that I did, I was suffering from a really deep, dark depression, and I didn't have the right support in place. I didn't have, a therapist can only do so much with you one-on-one, but I think it's really important to have community support. And after my divorce, that had basically dissolved, and I wanted a life do-over.
And the book is full of honesty like that. Tell us now, what are some of the things that you're suggesting the Army do, West Point do, to change that culture for women and related to harassment and sexual assault?
To start with, I think that sexual assault should be handled outside of the military, because when they're handled by the chain of command, there's a lot of chain of command compromise. I believe that commanders can also they can go the other way and have a zero tolerance policy in their units of harassment and assault. And so junior commanders might be too afraid to even report it. So that sets a precedent where things aren't even reported. So if things are handled, if the jurisdiction is outside of the military, then I think that gives people a better chance of getting the justice that they deserve. I also think that the military needs a significant cultural change. I believe that despite gender integration and despite, we've had racial integration for many years and with Don't Ask, Don't Tell being repealed, I think that there's still the notion of the all-American hero being a white, extroverted, conservative Christian, gun-toting male, and that anybody who doesn't live up to that particular image feels not so worthy of praise by society and isn't as rewarded in the military. And I would like to see some cultural shifts happening to where someone can be more feminine, or even on the spectrum of defaulting to war versus diplomacy. It's been really disturbing to me how President Obama has been criticized for not being tough enough, because he might be more prone to seek out a diplomatic solution. And I think that culturally the military should consider diplomacy more. I think that we shouldn't just default to wanting to go to war and wanting to invade and being this tough force.
When you guys are over there, your line of thinking there, did the troops feel that this was a war that was endless, that wasn't winnable? Did you feel that on the ground? I know I was kind of surprised when you were first going in that they didn't really tell you where the heck you were going or anything.
Yeah, it was too premature to draw those conclusions, because I deployed to Kuwait in January of 2003, and then the invasion started in March of 2003. And I didn't even have a radio in my vehicle. I didn't even have a map. I didn't get a map until after I left the unit a year later. Jeez. When they're like, here's your going away gift. Here's a framed map. I'm like, this would have been helpful for me to have going into Iraq.
All right, let's get to mental health now. There's, as you say in the book, 22 veterans are committing suicide a day. What recommendations do you have for veteran mental health? My
very first recommendation isn't necessarily very popular among veterans, but I believe that getting rid of guns is the number one easy way to help with the suicide rate, because I think that in my case, I didn't have a gun at home. My ex-husband had guns. So once we divorced, he took the guns. And I know how quick and easily accessible guns are, and that veterans are very comfortable with them. And so when they are in a dark, depressive state and decide they want to take their lives and they have access to a gun, it's just too easy to make that end. A lot of great messages there. I hope the military hears you. Would you recommend women go to West Point and get in the military? That's a really loaded question. I know that if I had to do it all over again, I would definitely choose a different path. Mm-hmm. If women do want to do that, then they need to seriously consider why they're doing it and to be better prepared. So it really is, it depends on the individual. But if someone's doing it because they want a special education and an exciting career, then they need to consider other things. War Virgin, My Journey of Repression, Temptation, and Liberation, a memoir by Laura Westley. Laura, great to talk to you. Thanks for calling. Thank you so much, Jim. It's been such an honor. I appreciate it. I'm Jim Campbell, host of Syndicated Business Talk with Jim Campbell. And now we're joined by Elizabeth Koehler-Pentacoff. She's the author of 10 books, and the latest out in paperback now, The Missing Kennedy, The Secret Bonds of Four Women. It's personal story, too. Her aunt, sister, Paulus Koehler, was Rosemary Kennedy's beloved friend and caregiver for years. And welcome, Liz. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me today.
No, it's our honor. Okay, remind us exactly who is the missing Kennedy and tell her how you got to know her.
Well, Rosemary Kennedy is the younger sister of our 35th president, Jack Kennedy, and I got to know her when my aunt, a Franciscan nun in Wisconsin, where I grew up, was assigned her care. So I met Rosie when I was 4 years old, and Rosie would have been 43, and I visited her throughout my life.
Fascinating. How did you find her when you got old enough to, sort of understand how to relate with her?
I thought that she was loving and gentle and fun. She loved bright colors and music. We danced together. We took long walks together. She was a great swimmer. She'd love to dive off the diving board with a big grin on her face. However, she wasn't always that way. She was a very vivacious young woman, and she was diagnosed. They called it mentally retarded. We would say mentally challenged. However, today doctors feel that she really would have been diagnosed as learning disabled. Unfortunately, she also came down with symptoms of mental disease in her teens and young 20s. And that is when they really were desperate for something to help Rosemary, as there were no drugs at the time available, and mental institutions were very stark and horrifying. So that is when she had a very disastrous surgery called the lobotomy when she was 23 years old.
We'll get into that a little bit. The original cause of problem has been linked to at the birth process. Is that true? Do you buy into what exactly happened?
The original process was that the nurse was administering to Rose, her mother, in Rose's bedroom, and the baby Rosemary was ready to come, and her head was crowning. However, the problem was the doctor was late. And in 1918, when Rosemary was born, nurses felt very inferior to doctors, and they were afraid to do a delivery by themselves, as well as, if the doctor wasn't there, the doctor wouldn't get paid. So the nurse didn't want to lose her job, so she told Mrs. Kennedy to hold her legs shut and keep the baby inside. Well, this was took a while before the doctor arrived, and so the thought was that perhaps some loss of air in the birth canal caused Rosemary to be slower than her very academic and athletic and competitive family.
Very sad. She obviously coming from one of the most public families in America, overachievers. How much criticism, before we get to Joe alone on the lobotomy, do you attach to the family versus the stigma with mental health at the time was?
Well, when I was young, I had carried a lot of anger for Joe and Rose, both of them, because I kind of blamed them for what happened to Rosemary. Now, as an adult, I read a lot about what happened with any type of mental illness or mental challenge. And at the time, Rosemary was born in 1918, and all the way through the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, mental illness was regarded with such fear and disgust that, they thought that if someone was mentally ill in the family, that it could be contagious or that the devil caused it. And families who had someone who was disabled would hide them away in attics and in basements for fear of not only being ostracized in the community, but they could lose their jobs, they could be kicked out of their homes, and of course violent acts happened to these families as well as the poor people themselves. Doctors, even when Rosemary was first diagnosed, advised Rose and Joe to put her away in an institution and never visit her again, because they said that visits from family members would be too much of an upheaval for any of the patients.
So how did it come to that Joe Kennedy made this decision by himself, didn't even tell Rose, that they try what was sort of an experimental prefrontal lobotomy with a doctor that wasn't even a doctor, right? He wasn't a surgeon,
right.
I mean.
Well, he wasn't a surgeon. He did have a partner that he paired himself with who was a surgeon. However, the doctor, Dr. Walter Freeman, the neurologist, was Yale educated. He taught at George Washington University, and he just loved publicity. He knew how to manipulate the press so that newspaper articles, New York Times, the Ladies' Home Journal, the Reader's Digest, Every major newspaper and magazine exclaimed how wonderful this new procedure was, that it would calm unruly patients down and give them a very happy life. And so when Joe looked around and said, what do I do with my beautiful daughter who's suffering so much, he saw the state of institutions, and he didn't want to put her in some ancient old fire trap. So he sought out the best, which he could see in all the media, and that was Dr. Freeman.
All righty. Before we get to how her life was changed by your aunt, let's anger for a second. Was Rose Kennedy anger that she wasn't told by Joe, and was Rosemary Kennedy angry when Rose finally visited her after 20 years?
Absolutely. Rose did not know, and the family did not know where Rosemary was or what had happened to her from 1941 until 1961. And what changed was that Joe himself had a stroke. Ironically, then he could not communicate or walk. And so the nuns at St. Coletta, where Joe ended up taking Rosemary when she was abused at Craig House, called Joe and had no response. So they had to contact Mrs. Kennedy. And when Mrs. Kennedy learned the truth, she just was so upset. And from then on, Rosemary had a very happy and loving life.
She'd been having these tantrums, violence. She was running away. Was your aunt the person that the unconditional love that turned all that around?
Absolutely. Before that, it was people didn't really know how to relate to anyone who was exhibited violence or temper tantrums or really was unhappy or disabled. And my aunt came along, and her training and her, I believe, just she was innately a gentle, calm soul, and she related to Rosemary with love and respect. She talked to Rosemary like she would talk to you or I, and Rosemary knew this and appreciated it, and she always worked with the positive. She never, yelled at Rosemary. She just said, "Oh, Rosemary, I know what a good job you can do with putting your napkin in your lap and picking up your fork and your knife." And then Rosemary would always be happy and well-behaved.
Now let's get on. In some ways, her impact may have lived on longer than JFK in the sense of the Kennedy family put focus on mental illness in the Special Olympics. Tell us all about that.
In 1962, when Eunice was able to visit her sister, she looked at a bulletin board at St. Coletta, and it's described the residents there as special children of God. Eunice really liked that, and so that's why she started what she called Special Olympics. She really wanted to make sure that everyone with a disability had enough exercise and fun. So she started it right in her backyard, and as her husband, Sergeant Shriver, said, she wasn't just administering the program. She was in the pool teaching the kids to swim. She was on horseback riding, playing the games with them. And, of course, Special Olympics today is an absolutely huge organization worldwide, which has helped millions.
Great story. When did Rosemary pass away? Because she basically outlived almost all of her siblings.
She lived until 2005 at the age of 86. And today we still have one remaining Kennedy. Jean Kennedy is still alive, and she's in her 80s.
We've been talking with Elizabeth Koehler-Pentacoff. The book is The Missing Kennedy, The Secret Bonds of Four Women. It's about Rosemary Kennedy, and it's the only first-person account of Rosemary Kennedy after her lobotomy. There's 100 pictures, by the way, in the book, and you really get a sense of her and how functional she was and how much love she had surrounding her from your aunt to the Kennedy family. The book is also the subject of a cover story in People magazine. You can go to lizbooks.com to learn more about Elizabeth, and we thank you for your time. Appreciate it. Enjoyed the book.
Well, thank you so very much.
We're joined now by Ellen Ratner. She's from Talk Media News and Fox News. And right before the final explosive presidential debate, that third debate in Vegas between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, she joined us and made a bold prediction and filled us in on all that was going on in the election at that point. So let us talk with Ellen Ratner. Ellen, it's Jim Campbell. Thanks for calling. How are you?
Thank you so much. Okay, well, I am in Sin City for the debate.
Oh, you are out there. I guess Sin City is pretty appropriate for this, the level of this campaign.
Oh my gosh! Do you believe what we deal with? We deal with sex instead of policy.
We were just talking about that as we were waiting for you, that this thing is just the civility of these debates is now at a level where you would not allow your fifth grade middle school student to use language or even this approach.
So the question is, each of them has to make a decision. The first decision they have to make is, who are they going to try and reach? Are they going to try and reach their gut-level supporters, such as, is Trump going to talk about how an election is rigged or whatever because his supporters like that? Mm-hmm. Or is he going to try and be more presidential and try and reach the middle? Same with Hillary Clinton. Is she going to try and throw red meat to her supporters, or is she going to try and get the millennials and other mid-level voters out of their homes to vote for her by really talking about policy?
Do you think Trump has reached a stage where he's almost playing not to win, but playing to find excuses and just to focus on his base? And another way of asking this is he going to end up more worried about his brand than getting elected?
Well, a lot of people who are in the real estate business, and my family's in the real estate business, so I know a lot of people in the real estate business. Mm-hmm. And I've talked to a lot of them, and a lot of them feel that if he does not win the presidency, the Trump brand goes out the window, and he, of course, wants to continue making money. This isn't like The Apprentice where he can say you're fired. And so that's a very interesting question you bring up. Does he want to protect his Trump brand more than he wants to be president of the United States?
An addendum to that, have you heard the rumors or that Trump TV may be in the offing?
Well, yes, and we all thought Roger Ailes was going to sort of run it. But now there's an article, but again, we don't know whether there's anything to the article or not, because the Ailes camp has not said anything, that Ailes has left the Trump campaign, saying that he just didn't agree with them, and the Trump campaign is supposedly saying that Ailes was not focused. So I don't know what that's going to be, but apparently, if that is true, that's not good news for Donald Trump. Because I know Roger Ailes, and he's one bright human being. Mm-hmm. But we just don't know.
All right,
we don't know if it's true.
Let's go back to the gutter for a second, Ellen. Do you see the sexual assault allegations surfacing at all? Of course, there's now the woman from People magazine claims to have 6 people supporting her story, Donald Trump claiming they're all 100% fictitious.
Well, I think that if there is an opening, Hillary Clinton will try and get that in there. There's no question, because she knows that without buying advertising, that there will be millions and millions of people watching it. So whatever she gets in is going to save her from spending that money in advertising. If there's a way that she can work it in, and trust me, my guess is that with her debate prep people, she is trying to work that in.
Okay, on the other side, does Trump go after the latest WikiLeaks emails?
Oh, he certainly does. My guess is that he will be prepared with 3 or 4 things in the WikiLeaks material and will bring it up. I would bet my last dollar on that one.
Do you think he's been disciplined enough to actually do some prep, to actually not just take the bait every time she plays with him almost?
That is your guess and my guess. I have no idea. Even though I'm in Las Vegas and I can bet odds, I don't know.
Now, I assume you've covered some of his rallies and things like that.
Yes, we have.
Do you feel fear and the hatred that apparently is getting, thrust out on the media at these things?
I don't. I mean, and our people have been there, and they have not also. I think it's very isolated. I think it does get picked up by the press, but I don't necessarily think. I think people go into these rallies on both sides with a very positive feeling for their candidate.
Now, are you in the camp yet that says the election is already over, that Trump really doesn't have
No, actually, I am, I'm a liberal Democrat. Everybody knows I'm voting for Hillary, even though, to me, she's a right-winger, because I was a Bernie person.
I was going to say, you sound like a Bernie.
I will tell you that I actually think that Donald Trump might win. I do.
Explain that to me.
I think that a lot of people are going to go into the booth, and they're going to they're going to vote for Trump, or they're going to stay home feeling that Hillary is ahead so much. And then they are going to leave and lie to the, polling people outside, and they're going to say, I voted for Hillary, and they will have voted for Trump.
Let me ask this then. Trump seems to have a coat of Teflon because, from sexual allegations to not paying taxes to bankruptcies, on, and to stuff that's come out of his mouth, none of this is going to sink him, is what you're saying.
I'm saying I'd be very surprised if anything sinks him. He seems to be very Teflon. They said that about Ronald Reagan, but I got news for you. I think Trump is even more Teflon. But I do agree with you that if he does not think he's going to win, if his internal polling does not show that he's going to win, and that's internal polling, he's going to go to protect his brand.
Why do you think that Hillary has not been more successful with millennials and folks like this, in particularly because the first woman president would seem to be something that would be a rallying cry?
Well, it's very interesting. After the last debate in St. Louis, I went into the spin room, and Trump had a lot of younger people there. He also had some older people, and Hillary had no young people. The campaign has got to do a reach out to younger people.
Is Hillary just out of touch or unlikable?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not a campaign person. I'm just a press person. But I will tell you that she needs to get younger people as the spokesperson. She has her daughter going out, but she needs other young people as well. Maybe college Democrat people coming out for her, et cetera.
Okay, now in this campaign where people feel both candidates are so unlikable, are you surprised that Gary Johnson hasn't caught on more, or he's put his foot in his mouth?
No, because he was not very well liked as governor of New Mexico.
Oh, really?
And I also interviewed him, and I found him to be not this election, last time he was running, I found him to be pretty belligerent. So I think that there is that side to him, and that's why he's not catching on more. I think the vice presidential candidate that they have, the former governor of Massachusetts, is a much more likable person, and that's who they should have run for president.
Yeah, they should have been reversed, probably, right?
Exactly.
You mentioned Roger Ailes at the beginning. What do you think's happening to the future of Fox News?
I honestly don't know. I work for Fox News as a liberal analyst there. But nobody knows, and frankly, nobody talks about it there either.
Really? So they're just doing their jobs?
No. People do their jobs, and no one talks about it.
Very interesting. Ellen, you seem to have the pulse of everything there, and I would say kind of a surprising insight that you think Trump still has a realistic chance.
I do, actually. Everybody thinks I'm insane, but maybe I am.
Wow. Well, thanks for calling in, as always.
Thank you.
We've been talking with Ellen Ratner from Talk Media News and Fox News about the final debate and all the goings in the presidential campaign as we get right near the finish line. Thanks for being with us, Ellen. You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. This is Segment 5 Overtime. And I've been looking forward to this interview. I love having Len. He's a fellow Dartmouth guy, too. And as I call him, an unsung hero from the Martha Moxley murder story. Len Levitt, hired by the Greenwich Times and Stanford Advocate to investigate 1975, now 40 years ago. And the papers, for some reason, perhaps lack of courage, didn't publish his reporting for years. His article in 91, though, helped relaunch the investigation, leading ultimately to the arrest and conviction of Michael Skakel in the year 2000. Len's the author of Conviction about the Skakel case, and he currently runs the website NYPD Confidential. Just had something out, I think I read yesterday. And we've got Len here because there's been a fair amount going on in the case. We'll ask you to give a brief overview, and then the habeas corpus appeal, and then Bobby Kennedy Jr., who is Michael Skakel's cousin, has a book out. So go ahead and give us the brief overview first of where we're at.
This case has been a 40-year legal odyssey with no end in sight. The latest is that we're waiting for the Connecticut State Supreme Court to make a decision as to whether they're going to agree with the judge who says that Michael's attorney was incompetent at his trial, which means a new trial. And that decision could come, who knows, weeks, months. Nobody seems to know. Meanwhile, Michael is out of jail. He's always maintained his innocence. He served 11 years in jail. The latest episode in this thing, this ongoing saga, is a book by his cousin Bobby Kennedy, who's always maintained that Michael is innocent, and now he's come up with two new suspects who he says he has definitive proof that they should be indicted, and they are two black guys from the Bronx. Now, they were teenagers then. They're now in their mid-50s, I suppose. And I spent some time with one of them in New York, interviewed him, and there is no way in the world that these guys had anything to do with the murder. This one guy, Al Hasbrook, who Kennedy named by name in his book, is a guy who He's a college graduate, an Army veteran. He's had a job for 15 years. He's married, been married for 20 years. He's got a grown daughter. The guy is just an ordinary, good citizen. And it's one thing to say my cousin Michael Skakel is innocent. Fair enough. He's, that's fine if he wants to say that. But Bobby didn't leave it at that. Bobby has libeled this guy, libeled him, and the second black guy over here, a fellow by the name of Burton Tinsley. And in one of his interviews, I think it was on Dateline, Bobby said, well, if they're innocent, let them sue me. That's big talk from a guy who comes from a lot of money, a big name, and a lot of privilege. These are ordinary people who don't have the money to hire a lawyer, no lawyer is taking a libel case on contingency. You got to pay him up front. And somebody has got to be around to make Bobby Kennedy be accountable for these charges that he's leveled against just ordinary citizens. I mean, he could do this to anybody. Next thing I'm going to know is going to be saying that I killed Martha Moxley.
Now, you say you were confident that there's no way Al Hasbrouck could have done this, right? And Bobby, of course, quotes this interview with Tony Bryant, who was Kobe Bryant's cousin, who says that these guys were in Greenwich. They went caveman on Martha, and you're confident that this is just bogus?
Well, not only is it bogus, but let's look who this guy Tony Bryant is. He's a guy who pled guilty to an armed house robbery. He owes the government millions of dollars in back taxes. He was fired by a Texas law firm that thought he would pass the bar, thought he was a lawyer, and he wasn't. For whatever reason, in this guy's mixed-up mind, he's come up with this story, and credulous Bobby Kennedy bought it all. Tony Bryant refuses to be interviewed. He won't talk to the police. He won't talk to the authorities. Bobby Kennedy's reason, says, "Oh, I understand that. It's racism." Give me a break.
Let me ask you, Bobby reports that when he first got Tony Bryant on the phone, he said, "I've been waiting for this call for 27 years." And secondly, he quotes Hasbrouck as admitting that he was in Greenwich on that night.
I don't know where. Well, first of all, Tony Bryant, and he's been waiting for this call. That's good for Hollywood. Tony Bryant is already wanted to make a movie out of this thing. Hasbrouck never. If Hasbrouck admitted that, the Kennedy people would have admitted that into evidence in 2007 when Michael Skakel's attorneys tried to get a new trial based on Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s supposed newly discovered evidence. Nothing like that was ever entered into the trial. Hasbrouck never admitted to being in Greenwich the night of the murder. This is pure fantasy on Tony Bryant's part, and Bobby Kennedy bought it. And the idea, the bit about going caveman, isn't that great? Playing to the old, as Hasbrouck said in the interview, it's always the black guy they're going to blame. They had this guy up in Boston 20 years ago. He claimed the white guy whose wife was killed, and he claimed the black guy did it, and it turned out he did it himself. There was a woman in South Carolina who claimed her kids, a black guy, carjacked their car and killed her two little kids, when it turned out that Susan Smith drove the car into the river herself with the kids in it. So he's just playing to the basest of racial stereotypes. And then he had the nerve to write a letter claiming that I'm calling him a liar and a racist. Give me a break, Bobby.
It's interesting, too, because in light of him saying, go ahead and daring him to sue him, if you look at the transcript of the tape calls that Bobby made to Al Hasbrouck, there's no mention of Bobby even asking him if he was in Greenwich that night, much less him saying that he was in Greenwich.
I don't recall the tapes themselves, but, here Bobby, as I understand it, Bobby calls this guy cold. The guy doesn't know who he says, Bobby Kennedy. Oh, great, how you doing? Nice to talk to you. It's really good. And he totally misled the guy. Yeah. Hasbrouck had no idea what was going on, that Bobby Kennedy was trying to trick him into making a confession, which, of course, he never did. And
no one saw Hasbrouck, Tinsley, or
Tony
Bryant.
Bryant.
Yeah.
Nobody has ever come forward. The police have never turned up anybody who saw any of the three there that night at the night that Martha Moxley was murdered.
Now, the case that Bobby's making is basically that Michael was framed, and we just went through the caveman theory. But he claims that, Tom Sheridan, who's this guy that hired the Sutton report, which obviously you were one of the instrumental folks in uncovering. Do you buy that Tom Sheridan was trying to frame Michael?
Tom Sheridan, my relationship with Tom Sheridan was that he always was protecting Michael. He always maintained that Michael was innocent. Michael hated Sheridan because I think there was a money problem with the father and trust fund, and Sheridan was very protective of the father that way. And I don't know the internal workings of the Skakel family in any great detail, but I do know is that Sheridan did say to me that there was a financial thing, that Michael wanted money and he wasn't about to give it to him.
Now, both Michael and Tommy changed their stories, perhaps to account for any DNA that might have been were to have been uncovered. Do you have any insight as to what the ultimate meaning was of them both changing their stories like that?
I don't. I don't pretend to understand the character, the personality, whatever you want to call it, of the Skakel family. What I do feel, I happen to agree with the lead detective on this matter, who has a very bad opinion of the Skakels. He says they're all liars. And whereas I disagree with the detective on a number of things, I do agree with him that you cannot believe a word that any of the Skakels say. There is an element in that night that Martha was murdered, a time element that nobody knows anything about. We just don't know what happened that night, and we don't know when the murder happened. We don't know whether Tommy's news story is true or not. We don't know whether Michael's news story is true or not. All we do know is that they lied to the police about their whereabouts the night of the murder, and that's what they admitted to their own investigators. Now,
for 20-some-odd years, that Michael was assumed to have an airtight alibi in the backcountry at their cousin's, the Terrian. Do you think, A, that he was never the backcountry, or B, does it matter in terms of the timing of the...
Well, it matters to me in that I'd like to understand what happened that night. There are two theories over here. One is that he never went to the backcountry, that Martha was killed about 10 o'clock that night. And the second theory is that he did go to the backcountry, and he came back, and that's when he told the story of running out to the murder scene and climbing a tree outside Martha's window and masturbating in the tree, blah, blah, blah. So the question is, from a legal standpoint, it doesn't matter whether he went to his cousins or not. But I have to say, if I was on the jury and a lawyer and Michael's lawyer said, look, they don't even know when this happened. They can't say that Michael did it because they don't know. Did he go to the backcountry? Did he not go to the backcountry? The prosecutor said one thing. The lead detective believes something else. I think I would have been very hesitant as a juror to have convicted Michael, because nobody knows definitively what happened that night.
The tree, the amazing tree story. Michael's latest rendition of that was that it was outside John Moxley's window, right? And I asked John Moxley, and he said that there was no tree by his window that would have been climbable of that to get up there. And Martha's was on the third floor, which would have been bigger.
You know, it was interesting at the appeal to the state Supreme Court. Michael's lawyer started talking about that tree. He says, this tree story that the state came with, it doesn't make any sense. Because, well, there was no tree, the tree couldn't be climbed. But here's the thing, the government didn't make that up. It wasn't the authorities that turned up the tree story. It was Michael himself who manufactured this thing. So, again, I certainly don't understand the motivations of Michael Skakel. I mean, the guy, the whole family is a troubled family. It's a family with, just true emotional, mental disorder, whatever it is.
We're talking with Len Levitt, the longtime investigative journalist on the Moxley murder case. The habeas corpus ruling, I guess, first off, that's based on the fact that Mickey Sherman, who's a Greenwich-based attorney, had to be deemed incompetent for that case to be thrown out.
That's right.
That's a pretty radical interpretation of that incompetence, isn't it? Because he wasn't drunk or sleeping or not showing up.
And he presented a defense, that was fairly credible, I suppose. But again, I'm talking now as a legal expert, just as an ordinary citizen. Anybody watching that case, Mickey Sherman was, let's say, not at his best. I don't think he took the case seriously. His opening line in his final argument, he stood in front of. I never forgot it. I mean, this happened 15 years ago. I can still remember his words. He started off, "He didn't do it." That's such a cocky, jocular kind of approach. And
I remember that too. He not only said he didn't do it, he said, and he doesn't know who did.
That's right. And I mean, I can understand the fury of the Skakel family on Mickey Sherman that way. On the other hand, I think the judge overlooked something really important here that's probably not that doesn't jump out at you from the transcripts, and that is the judge was critical of Mickey Sherman for making Ken Littleton, the tutor who moved into the house the night of the murder, what they call the third-party suspect, I suppose. And he said, they should have made Tommy Skakel the third-party guy. But here's the thing that's so interesting, is that the first investigator on this case, a state investigator named Jack Solomon, was so convinced that Littleton had done this that even after Michael was indicted and Solomon retired, he ended up testifying for Michael's defense. Now, I've been doing this for a long time. I've never seen a detective on a case suddenly turn around and testify for the defendant. The judge made no mention of that, but that certainly would give a certain justification for Mickey Sherman making Ken Littleton the third-party culpability guy.
If the appeal goes in Michael's favor, the state has a decision to make whether to do a new trial, right?
Correct.
Now, the question is, after all these years, is reasonable doubt almost automatic, especially if they point at Tommy? I mean, should the state have another trial?
Well, of course, that's a decision, that's going to be left to the state's attorney. But if I were the state's attorney, I would definitely not retry Michael. I know a lot of egos are probably involved in this, but I don't see the point in retrying him. He's done 11 years. I know Mrs. Moxley would like to see a new trial, but I think the chances of convicting Michael now are going to be pretty slim. This is, 15 years after a first trial, 40 years after, I don't know.
So he's it could be in a win-win position. In other words, if he loses the appeal, I guess if he loses the appeal, he goes back to jail. Supposedly.
But, I mean, is there really any reason to send him back to jail? I mean, he's done 11 years. I mean, to me, enough is enough. But so I'm not sure it's a win-win position. I mean, if on the slim chance that they're going to overturn this judge's decision, he theoretically could go back to jail. Even practically, he could go back to jail. But I wonder if there's any point in doing that.
Do you, in your own mind, having studied this been involved in investigating for 45 years, do you think that reasonable doubt is a fair thing to attach to Michael because Tommy put himself close to the scene as well?
I do. I've always had a reason. As I said, if I were a juror on that, I was surprised at the verdict, to tell you the truth. I mean, I believe Michael did this, but I've got enough reasonable doubt even if it's 2%. Yeah. Is that reasonable? I think it is. I think there's enough of a doubt in people's mind that, at this point anyway, it's going to be very tough to convict them again.
Len Levitt, also always very insightful. Len, tell us, as we finish up, what NYPD Confidential is about.
Well, during this case, I was working for much of this case, I was working for New York Newsday, and I was covering the police department. And after New York Newsday left New York, I continued writing about the police department online. And I used this, and I just changed the name of the column. I think with Newsday it was One Police Plaza. So I changed it to NYPD Confidential. And it's, when I first started, I thought it would last about 3 months. And I remember the chief of internal affairs said to me, "Len, what are you doing? How are you going to continue this?" And now it's, 20 years later, and it's still going strong. So it's turned out well.
How can folks sign up for getting the newsletter, which I nicely get now?
I think you just go to the website. There's just put in NYPD Confidential, and there's a thing, I'm not a computer guy, but I have a webmaster who worked it out where you just hit something and it comes to you.
It's very easy. It's nypdconfidential.com. I think it comes out weekly, right?
Yes, every Monday, and then the column appears in AM New York, which is a paper that the Newsday bought, and that is circulated in the subway. That comes out the next day.
Okay, final question. How are you going to remain involved in this case? Just through NYPD Confidential, or how are you going to continue to investigate and get stuff out? The only person, I think, who's talked to Al Halsbrook, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I said to Frank Garr, the detective on this thing, I said, "Frank, Skakels are never going to admit their guilt, but we're going to be here every step of the way. You've retired, fair enough. I'll be around, and so I'm doing this on NYPD Confidential. It's also the last two stories I wrote about Bobby Kennedy appeared in the Greenwich Time and Stanford Advocate.
He's not very happy with you, I'm told.
That's what I understand. Well, that's life."
Is a big driver for you to help Mrs. Moxley get closure, or is...
Yes.
Yes.
Mrs. Moxley and I go way back. She was a different person when I met her, and I suppose I was a different person when she met me, and she's been very helpful to me. I remember when, at the beginning, I perked up her spirits. I said, "I'm going to write this story. Everything's going to come out in the story." And then after I wrote it and the local papers didn't print it, she was consoling me. And she said, "Len, don't worry, be patient. It's going to turn out all right." And, it did. The story finally ran, albeit 9 years later.
It's one of the things, you control your ego very well. But Mark Furman came in from the O.J. case and kind of stole a lot of thunder. But I've always heard you're appreciative that he helped get the case back in the front of...
I'll tell you, Furman may have had a lot of trouble with O.J., but I give him a lot of credit over here. I mean, Furman is Furman. He's into himself. But I think he did, in terms of raising the profile of this case, it was a national story to begin with, but it didn't have I don't think the pizzazz until Furman came in. And I think his name did give him that. And I thought he, on the whole, I mean, there were a number of things I would question in his book, but on the whole, I thought he did a pretty good job, he and his ghostwriter.
Well, when this history is finally written, obviously you're going to play a major role in keeping the story alive and hopefully getting to the truth someday. I want to thank Len Levitt. Again, he's a journalist, investigative journalist. He's covered the Moxley case now for over 40 years. Thank his wife for being with us here and being patient as well.
Thank you, Jim. Nice to be here.